General Hospital spoilers tease that the death of Natalia was never meant to be the final chapter in her story, but rather the prologue to a far more dangerous and unraveling truth. One that now threatened to ignite the deepest, most volatile war Port Charles had seen in years. What was first considered a tragic loss amidst the growing hostilities between Sunny and Sidwell was quickly transforming into something much darker, much more calculated. It was no longer about grief, it was about legacy, silence, and power. And at the center of this transformation stood a single, incendiary document, Natalia's will. Her death, sudden and suspicious, had already left Sunny fractured and haunted by guilt, but the revelations buried in her final testament were now pushing him into a state of obsession. A boiling point from which there may be no return. Natalia had not died aimlessly, nor had she been an accidental casualty in a turf war between two powerful men. The emergence of her will revealed a far more chilling narrative, that Natalia had known her life was in danger, and that she had spent her final months not running or hiding, but documenting, preparing, and securing pieces of evidence that now pointed directly at Sidwell. Her will wasn't a collection of wishes, it was a blueprint of exposure. Hidden within her personal effects were coordinates to a secure drive, names encoded within her journal entries. Vague but irrefutable allusions to operations Sidwell had overseen or sanctioned under the guise of shadow diplomacy and illegal influence peddling. The drive itself, now in Sunny's possession thanks to a quietly loyal courier who had been waiting for the trigger of her death, contained hours of voice memos. Images of documents she had never dared send electronically. And a tear-filled recording in which Natalia named Sidwell as the man who had orchestrated at least 3 acts of violence against her family, including the arson at Charlie's pub. For Sunny, this changed everything. He had already been simmering with rage, unsure of how deeply Sidwell's hand had penetrated the recent tragedies in his life, but now, with Natalia's final words echoing in his ears, that rage sharpened into a singular mission, vengeance through exposure. This wasn't just about protecting his family anymore, this was about honoring the woman who had died trying to stop a monster. And ensuring that her death wouldn't be rewritten as a footnote in someone else's scheme. But as Sunny pushed deeper into Natalia's files, he quickly realized how high the stakes had become. Natalia hadn't simply collected secrets, she had dismantled an entire conspiracy, piece by piece, and the information she had compiled had the power to implode powerful institutions, including elements of the WSB, state-level alliances, and financial empires built on blackmail and war profiteering. Sidwell wasn't just a bitter enemy. He was a man at the center of an international rot that Natalia had dared to drag into the light. Now the consequences were multiplying. From the moment word of the will's existence spread, Sunny's world became a battleground. Anonymous threats were left on his doorstep. Surveillance around his family increased. Jason was nearly ambushed while transporting a copy of the files from the Quartermain estate to a secure location. Legal documents filed to challenge the authenticity of the will appeared within days, signed by entities no one had ever heard of, shell corporations, false aliases. All clearly meant to stall and confuse. Sidwell was fighting back, not with direct attacks, but with precision warfare, using influence, money, and fear to suffocate the truth before it could surface. Port Charles itself began to feel the pressure. Journalists who had quietly received tips started disappearing from press briefings. One editor was found unconscious in his car with his computer wiped clean. A hospital administrator close to Portia was suspended under mysterious ethical allegations. And still, the tension continued to mount. Trina, already reeling from the threats tied to Curtis's investigation, now found herself caught in the crossfire of a war no one had prepared her for. Portia, terrified for her daughter, begged Sunny to stand down, to let the legal system handle the truth. But Sunny knew the truth all too well, there would be no justice in silence. And Natalia had entrusted him with her voice. The pressure on Sunny was suffocating. He barely slept, poring over the data each night, connecting the dots between Natalia's leads and the ongoing corruption embedded deep in the city's political arteries. Every image of her on the screen, every crack in her recorded voice, made his resolve stronger. But it also made him more dangerous. His patience was eroding. He began pulling favors from men he had sworn never to call again. He activated alliances that had long gone dormant. His eyes, once full of grief, now glowed with purpose, and behind that purpose was a promise. He would burn Sidwell's empire to the ground with Natalia's ashes as the match. And yet, Sidwell was not cornered. He had resources, reach, and the cruelty of a man who believed he could manipulate every outcome. As Sunny moved forward, Sidwell retaliated with chilling precision. He began rewriting the narrative. Leaking false information that painted Natalia as emotionally unstable, hinting that her death may have been the result of mental illness, even planting false witnesses to support his claims. His game was psychological: undermine the story before it could gain traction. Discredit the woman before her words could be trusted. And for a moment, the tide seemed to shift. Officials began hesitating. Allies backed away. Media coverage grew murky. But Sunny pressed on. He gathered more allies: Brooke, Lynn, Jason, even Ava. Each bringing their own network of influence to push Natalia's story into the light. The pressure reached its climax when Sunny prepared to release the entirety of the drive in a public broadcast. One that would send shockwaves not only through Port Charles, but beyond. Sidwell knew the moment was coming. And he prepared for it in the only way he knew how: with fire. Another explosion was already in the works. Sidwell had planned his second arson carefully, a way to silence the message before it reached the world. But this time, Sunny was ready. This time, Natalia had warned him from beyond the grave. And this time, the war for truth would not be extinguished with flames. Because in death, Natalia had become more dangerous than she had ever been in life. And Sunny, driven by her memory, her pain, and her final confession, would stop at nothing to make sure the world remembered her not as a casualty, but as the woman who exposed the monster that Port Charles had allowed to thrive for far too long. Marco was shattered the moment he received word of Natalia's will. The shock didn't come merely from her death. He had barely begun to process that agony, but from the explosive, intricate truth buried in her final instructions. Natalia had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who moved in shadows yet saw everything. Someone who loved fiercely and protected those she cared for with silent, strategic grace. But even Marco, who knew her better than most, hadn't anticipated the weight of what she left behind. Her will was not a simple collection of goodbyes. It was a manifesto, a blueprint of unfinished battles, and a demand for justice that no one could ignore. And it had Marco spiraling into a state of obsession and emotional collapse. As he read through her final words, Marco felt the floor vanish beneath him. Natalia hadn't just documented her suspicions, she had named names, exposed networks, and carefully mapped the corruption she had uncovered before her death, including direct ties to Sidwell's operations and the conspiracy surrounding the arson at Charlie's pub. Her words revealed how long she had been hunted, how closely she had danced with death, and how deeply she had trusted Marco to finish what she had started. It wasn't just a legacy, it was a burden, and it was now his. The psychological toll hit immediately. Marco began to spiral. He shut off his phone, isolated himself from Sunny and Christina, refused to answer Jason's questions. For days, he disappeared from public view, lost in recordings of Natalia's voice. Trying to decode the subtle clues she left behind, the layers of her fear disguised in calm instructions. What haunted him most were the parts where she spoke directly to him, soft but urgent confessions that she had known she was being followed, that she had left out pieces of the truth to protect him. That he would know when the time came what to do. That time, now terrifyingly real, had arrived, and Marco was not ready. But even in his fear, a plan began to take shape. One name kept echoing through Natalia's final statements: Blaze. She had written it not as a footnote, but as a cornerstone of her final wishes. Blaze. The one person she believed could carry her voice beyond the reach of Sidwell's control. Blaze, who had stepped away from the chaos, who had chosen peace over performance. Natalia's wish was clear: her story, her truth, had to be heard, and not just in courtrooms or backrooms filled with threats. It had to be sung, shared, broadcast to the people who had turned a blind eye to Sidwell's rise. And Blaze was the only one who could deliver that message with both power and authenticity. Marco, shaken but resolute, made the decision. He would bring Blaze back to Port Charles, not just to mourn, but to ignite. He reached out, secretly, carefully, bypassing managers and publicists, speaking only to the person behind the image. At first, Blaze resisted. She had worked hard to distance herself from that life, from the shadows, from the noise, from Sidwell. But the moment she heard Natalia's voice on the final recording, tired, trembling, but unwavering, something inside her broke. Blaze had owed her career to Natalia's belief in her, and now she owed her voice to the woman's legacy. The performance Blaze had once feared, the spotlight she had once fled, was now the only way to finish what Natalia had begun. Word of Blaze's return sent tremors through Port Charles. For some, it was hope. For others, a warning. Sidwell immediately picked up on the shift and began moving pieces around the board. He dispatched lawyers to challenge the will, hired operatives to monitor Blaze's movements, and fed false narratives to the media attempting to frame Natalia as unstable. But it was too late. The will had been activated. The truth was in motion. Blaze wasn't just returning for a tribute, she was returning with a purpose. A concert was being arranged, but it wouldn't be just any show. It would be a televised, global event framed as a charity performance but embedded with Natalia's recordings, her words, her final message. Every lyric would be laced with meaning. Every spotlight a blade of resistance. Marco, still battling the grief that threatened to consume him, found new strength in the clarity of his mission. For the first time since Natalia's death, he felt her guiding him, not in memory, but in directive. His pain became fuel, his fear became resolve. He would protect Blaze, ensure Natalia's truth reached the world, and finally hold Sidwell accountable for everything he had tried to silence. What began as mourning had now become a movement. And Port Charles would never be the same again. The woman they tried to bury had returned as a storm, and Marco was the lightning she left behind. Marco was no longer simply mourning Natalia, he was evolving into something far more formidable and unpredictable. Her death had hollowed him out, burned away the softer remnants of who he used to be, and left in their place a man consumed by purpose, driven by obsession, and dangerously unbound by loyalty. The contents of Natalia's will had not only shifted the trajectory of his grief but redefined his very identity. What once was sorrow had sharpened into strategy. And what had begun as heartbreak was now methodically hardening into vengeance. This was no longer about justice, it was about control. About rewriting the rules that both Sonny and Sidwell had played by for far too long. Marco had begun orchestrating a seismic shift in the balance of power. And it was rooted in the very thing they had all underestimated, Natalia's final wishes. He was no longer willing to be the collateral damage in someone else's war. Instead, Marco was preparing to become the storm. Every move he made was laced with calculated risk. He stopped simply reacting to threats and started creating them. Behind closed doors. He consolidated information from Natalia's private vault, a data cache that implicated not just Sidwell in a sweeping criminal network, but also suggested Sonny had long known about certain covert WSB activities that endangered Christina and others. He didn't care that turning against Sonny might cost him the last of his allies. The illusion of safety had already been shattered the night Natalia died. And in his mind, the blood that had spilled on the floor at Charlie's pub didn't belong to just one side. Marco's twisted sense of purpose soon evolved into a meticulously layered plan. He began recruiting from the shadows, former WSB agents, disillusioned operatives, fringe players who had once served Sonny but now felt expendable, people who still owed debts to Natalia or feared what secrets she might have exposed. With each quiet meeting and coded message, Marco pieced together his army of truth and chaos. What he intended wasn't just retaliation, it was systematic destabilization. If Sidwell was fire, and Sunny was ice. Marco intended to break both apart with wind and stone. He became obsessed with not just controlling the narrative, but owning it entirely. Every ounce of pain he'd swallowed since Natalia's death. Every sleepless night spent staring at surveillance footage, was now fueling something dangerous and surgical. But the most terrifying part wasn't Marco's willingness to destroy, it was his clarity. He saw, with disturbing precision, how he could play the two men against each other. He leaked rumors about Sunny's involvement in covering up past WSB crimes to Sidwell's enemies. At the same time, he dropped subtle hints to Sunny's closest allies that Sidwell was planning another arson, potentially targeting properties Sunny didn't even realize were vulnerable. Marco didn't just want these men to fall, he wanted them to turn on each other first. And as they fought, distracted by their own paranoia and pride, he would slide into the power vacuum left behind. The obsession didn't end there. Marco began forging his own version of Natalia's legacy, a new network, one she never got the chance to finish building. He compiled her files into digital packets. Began programming a sequence of data dumps that would trigger based on timed events or physical access points, designed to expose either Sunny or Sidwell depending on who struck first. He wasn't just planting bombs, he was writing code into the very fabric of Port Charles's underworld. Every bar, every safe house. Every shell company that once served as a fortress of criminal power would now be wired to collapse under the weight of truth. And Marco alone held the detonator. But what made Marco even more dangerous was his willingness to sacrifice. He no longer cared about his reputation, or his survival. He had seen what grief could do, had felt it carve into his bones, and now he welcomed the madness. This gave him a kind of freedom neither Sunny nor Sidwell could match. They were still tied to empires, appearances, families. Marco was untethered. And with that came a ruthlessness that chilled even those closest to him. He had no interest in becoming the next kingpin of Port Charles. He wanted to dismantle the throne entirely. As the days passed and the tension between Sunny and Sidwell escalated, Marco began setting the final stages of his plan into motion. He met with Blaze in secret, sharing parts of Natalia's voice recordings that revealed the true extent of the danger, how deep Sidwell's reach went, how close Sunny had come to knowing but turning a blind eye, and how both had failed the very people they claimed to protect. Blaze, shaken but resolute, agreed to help. She would lend her voice to Marco's message, not as a performance, but as a revolution. The story Natalia had died protecting would finally be heard, and the city that once turned its back would be forced to face it head-on. But Marco wasn't done. The final piece, the most explosive revelation, was yet to come. Hidden within Natalia's encrypted files was a sealed document, one Marco hadn't opened, not until now. What he found inside changed everything. A medical file, a birth certificate, a WSB clearance code. It wasn't just Sidwell and Sunny who had secrets. There was another player, someone closer than anyone imagined. Someone with ties to Brit. Someone who could shatter both sides of the war. Marco knew what had to be done. He would release it, not with threats, but with silence. A press conference scheduled by Blaze. A private video sent to Ava, Jocelyn, and Dante. A secure drop to Anna's encrypted folder. Marco was about to break open the sky. And when the pieces fell, no one would walk away untouched. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reckoning. And Marco had already lit the match. The revelation of Natalia's will was not merely a bureaucratic conclusion to her tragic death. It was a ticking bomb laced with secrets, guilt, and unspoken intentions that sent tremors through every corner of Port Charles. At the epicenter of the blast stood Christina. Unexpectedly named as a beneficiary, not of material wealth, but of a moral and emotional responsibility that she neither asked for nor was prepared to carry. The contents of the will not only detailed Natalia's private struggles and unfinished work but connected Christina to a legacy so fraught with danger that it threatened to unravel the fragile peace she had tried to rebuild after surviving the fire at Charlie's pub. Natalia, in her final days, had made a decision that no one expected, entrusting Christina with the continuation of a social program for women recovering from domestic abuse and political persecution. A cause Natalia had quietly supported through shadowy channels, including international donors and underground shelters that had once been raided by corrupt WSB agents. For Christina, this was more than a philanthropic burden. She suddenly found herself at the center of a complicated legal entanglement that made her a target, by those who wanted to protect Natalia's secrets and by those who wanted to expose them. Blaze, who had once considered Natalia a mentor and silent supporter, was equally blindsided to discover that Natalia had appointed her co-executor of a vault of digital evidence, recordings, emails, surveillance footage, and testimonies documenting a wide-reaching network of manipulation that included Sidwell's connections to foreign investors, backroom dealings with members of the WSB, and possible surveillance on Sonny himself. Marco, Natalia's grieving son, who had only recently begun to come to terms with the magnitude of her death, viewed the will as a sacred roadmap, not for healing, but for justice. He had grown cold in his resolve, setting aside emotion for strategic retribution. Natalia had entrusted him with a final mission, and he would see it through to the end. But that mission was now tangled in personal loyalties. Kristina's presence in the will put her in direct conflict with her father, Sonny, whose war with Sidwell had already drawn blood and wrecked alliances. Sonny saw Kristina's involvement as dangerous, perhaps even foolish, and he suspected Marco was using her as a pawn to further his vendetta. Yet Kristina, changed by trauma and emboldened by the responsibility Natalia had given her, refused to back down. She began to pursue the truth with a new kind of clarity, seeking to understand not just who had killed Natalia, but why she had chosen Kristina to inherit such an explosive cause. Her meetings with Blaze became more frequent, the two women digging through files and audio logs, uncovering layers of corruption that went deeper than either of them could have imagined. They found audio of Natalia referencing a WSB file on Sonny's past operations and a hidden dossier marked the Black Iris that suggested Natalia had once been considered a threat by international intelligence. At the same time, Marco was preparing to bring Blaze back into the public eye, not as a singer, but as a witness. His plan was to hold a press conference, using Blaze's platform to leak select elements of Natalia's archive and force the authorities to reopen the investigation into Charlie's pub. This put Blaze in a precarious position. She wanted justice, but she also feared the fallout. Once the information went public, it could expose her own past dealings and drag Kristina into a storm of media and political backlash. Marco, however, had grown tired of patience. He believed Sonny was too compromised to protect Kristina, and Sidwell was too powerful to take down quietly. His grief had hardened into strategy, and he began forging alliances with Natalia's old contacts, shadowy figures who had operated in the margins of law enforcement and intelligence. They called themselves the gatekeepers, and they had protected Natalia once before. The tension reached a new height when Kristina received a private letter from Natalia, posthumously delivered through her attorney. The letter contained one line that shook Kristina to her core: "The fire was never meant for me, it was meant to silence what I knew." That sentence confirmed what Kristina had feared most, that her own family may have been peripherally connected to the forces that killed Natalia. It also confirmed for Marco that Natalia's death was not random, but a targeted assassination covered up as collateral damage. As these realizations unfolded, Blaze, Kristina, and Marco began to drift apart, each caught in a different orbit of guilt, fear, and resolve. Blaze wanted to protect Kristina from the storm. Kristina wanted to fulfill Natalia's mission, and Marco wanted revenge at any cost. Meanwhile, Sidwell began to move again, quietly shifting assets and calling in favors from old allies within the city's infrastructure. Rumors swirled that he was preparing for another attack, this time not on property, but on reputation. He knew Natalia's files could expose him, so he started circulating fake stories, planting evidence to discredit Natalia's mental health, suggesting she had fabricated the files out of paranoia. Blaze received a threat left in her dressing room before a charity performance. Kristina's non-profit application for Natalia's women's shelter was mysteriously rejected by city officials. Marco was followed home one night by an unmarked car. Everything pointed to escalation. The will, once viewed as a gesture of posthumous love and redemption, had become a declaration of war. Natalia had not just left behind instructions, she had left behind a spark in a room full of gasoline. And as Kristina's trust in her family wavered, Marco's obsession deepened, and Blaze's fear grew. One thing became terrifyingly clear: they were already too deep. There was no turning back. Natalia's final wish had not only opened the door to her truth, it had cursed the ones she left behind with the responsibility of surviving it. And whether they emerged stronger or destroyed would depend on how far each was willing to go for justice.